Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, delegates from around the world gather in Morocco for the opening of the COP22 Climate Change Conference. Top of the agenda is to act on the terms brought in under the agreement made at last year's Paris edition and roll back on the carbon emissions causing global average temperatures to keep hitting new records. Also, Sudan's removal of fuel subsidies prompts an angry response from the opposition. In response, authorities seize copies of newspapers and arrest top critics of the move. And youth trumps the day in New York, not in the way that you might be thinking. An Eritrean runner has become the youngest ever winner of the New York Marathon. We take a closer look. But first, diplomats from over 200 countries and 15,000 negotiators and activists are in Marrakesh for the opening of the COP22 climate talks. Last Friday, an agreement settled at last year's Paris event kicked in. It calls for nations to cap global warming at under 2 degrees Celsius. But scientists are already sending up red flags for the target. The task of tracking CO2 emissions and settling on compensation for poorer countries devastated by climate-fueled weather extremes is a daunting one. Africa is responsible for only a tiny proportion of the damage, but is already suffering disproportionately from rising temperatures.
The wealthiest countries live as if there were 3 planets, and the poorest countries live as if there was already no planet at all. So again, I ask for climate justice, especially for Africa. This is the greatest challenge of the COP22.
We have to all be ready for this world challenge and not disappoint the hopes of vulnerable populations. Did we not learn anything from the African proverb that says, the sun does not ignore a village just because it's small?
Well, with so many procedural issues to work out, those on the front line of battling the effects of climate change are desperate for concrete change to come out of the 12-day event. In Senegal, a quarter of the country's mangroves have been lost since the 70s to drought and deforestation.
A patrol in the marine area of Joal in western Senegal. It's a protected area, but conservationists often find scenes like this one.
Someone came here and cut the trees quickly. They took the wood and left.
The hardy mangrove shrubs thrive in salty water. They are home to a very rich biodiversity. Crabs, pelicans and hyenas are among those who live here.
Without the mangroves, there are no oysters, no carp. With no mangroves, many species of crabs, such as fiddler crabs, will disappear. So the mangroves are very, very important. Without them, lots of fish would also disappear.
Reforestation is a priority.
You take this off the tree, and then you plant them like this, and it's done.
Senegal has lost 40% of its mangroves since the 1970s. Reforestation programs began in 2009.
We saw that thanks to reforestation, wildlife and fish began to return. They came into the mangroves where they could grow before going out into the sea.
Mangroves aren't only receding because of people looking for firewood. Several factors are at play: oyster fishing, drought, public works, and, of course, climate change.
At least 25 soldiers died in fighting between rival forces in Somalia over the weekend. Troops from Puntland and Galmudug clashed in the divided town of Galkayo, and commanders from each side blamed the other for the violence. Galkayo has seen repeated fighting recently, and Sunday marked the collapse of a short-lived peace agreement between the two semi-autonomous states. On Monday, South African opposition leader Julius Malema called for land owned by the country's white minority to be taken over by black citizens. The leader of the economic freedom fighters delivered the speech before cheering supporters outside of a courthouse in Johannesburg and threatened to disturb the white man's peace. Now, he'd already been charged with inciting his supporters to invade land. His calls reflect frustration among some black South Africans over the lack of economic benefits for them since the end of apartheid.
The persecution of people who are demanding the land affects us directly because we want the land. So the land must be returned into the hands of the people. When a state has failed to give you the land for the past 22 years, it will be irresponsible of me to say continue waiting. That's why I say occupy the land, because they failed to give you the land.
Opposition group the Democratic Alliance has condemned Malema's statements. Well, in other news, several opposition figures have been arrested in Sudan in response to their criticism of a decision by the government to hike fuel prices. Now, the issue is a sensitive one, as in 2013, a move to slash subsidies sparked fatal protests. Our Simona Fontaine reports from Khartoum.
Days after the government of Sudan removed subsidies on fuel and electricity, ordinary citizens are starting to feel the pinch. The price of fuel and everything that depends on it has risen by 30%. It's an increase many Sudanese cannot afford.
Since the increases, business has been very slow. Yesterday, there were no customers. People are just watching what will happen.
But unlike in 2013, when thousands took to the streets to protest similar price hikes, this time people appear inclined to swallow the bitter pill.
Protests? No, I'm against them. They use live ammunition. They kill people. Why put myself in this situation?
The subsidy cuts were announced as part of a reform package aimed at tackling the country's worsening fiscal deficit. But the opposition claims lifting the subsidies will only push citizens deeper into poverty without solving the root causes of the economic crisis.
So they chose only to lift the subsidies, leaving other major items untouched. For example, a lot of the great deal of the budget is directed to the expenditure of the war.
Over the weekend, several newspapers had all their editions confiscated by security forces, and at least 4 members of the opposition were arrested for speaking out against the reforms.
Now it's quite clear for everybody that the government is not really wants to make this change, and nobody is allowed to speak, nobody is allowed to gather, nobody is allowed to make any political activities.
The government hasn't responded to repeated requests for interviews and declined to comment on these unpopular reforms.
In an annual speech usually delivered at home, Morocco's king this time spoke from Senegal in a bid to illustrate his country's commitment to the African Union. Now, Morocco's trying to rejoin the bloc 32 years after leaving in protest over the bloc's decision to accept the disputed territory of Western Sahara as a member. Now, Mohammed VI said that Rabat hasn't changed its position, that Western Sahara is integral to the Moroccan kingdom, but that the country is still keen to return to the seat at the African Union.
Morocco's reintegration into the African Union is not a tactical decision, nor is it calculated. Rather, it is the logical outcome of careful reflection. And when we announce our return, we won't ask permission in obtaining our legitimate rights. In any case, Morocco is back to regain its natural place. It has an overwhelming majority to take its seat in the institutional African family.
And finally, an Eritrean runner has become the youngest ever winner of the New York City Marathon. 20-year-old Guillaume Gebreselassie belted to victory in the prestigious race on Sunday, ahead of fellow African Kenyan champion Lucas Rotich, who came in second.
Meet Guillaume Gebreselassie. At just 20 years old, he's the youngest man to ever win the New York Marathon. Gebreselassie beat Kenya's Lucas Rotich, crossing the line in 2 hours, 7 minutes and 51 seconds.
We were helping each other before he drove back. Then after I look back once, he was a little bit far from me. And I was really a little bit angry with him because we were helping each other. I was thinking that maybe other athletes from behind can catch him.
Born in Eritrea, Gebre Selassie started running competitively in 2009. He won the 2015 World Championships in Beijing, China, and placed 4th in the 2016 Olympic Games in Rio. He is also the first athlete from Eritrea to win a major marathon.
Nobody has won any major marathon from Eritrea, and it's just like a championship for me to be the winner in such like a race.
Gebre Selassie will take home $100,000 for the win and another $25,000 for running under 2 hours and 8 minutes.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks very much for joining us. Please do so again if you can. Take care.